In 2012, on a forest road in Oregon, a teenage girl took a 5-minute bathroom break, and when she returned, her entire family had vanished. The car was covered in blood, and their clothes were torn to shreds, and their severed fingers were arranged in this mysterious triangle. But the true horror wasn't what happened to them in those 5 minutes, but it was the unsettling series of events that unraveled in the forest over the next 3 hours. 4 years later, Shea Robinson finally agreed to share her account with Officer Dunn from the Oregon State Police Department on the agreement that this would be the only time that she would ever openly relive the horrors of that day. This is a retold version of Shea's recorded account. I said I'd never talk about what happened to them, but I have to, don't I? Else it'll be like they don't exist anymore. Like it never really happened. So I will tell you once, just once, without interruptions. And then I'm never speaking of this again. We were on a family vacation to my uncle's cabin deep in the Tillamook State Forest in Oregon. And I'd been there a couple times before, usually with my cousins, and I liked the simplicity of it. The endless green, and only the insects for company. And the last time that I went, I collected the longhorn beetles in a glass jar so I could just watch them. Their twitching antennae and their iridescent shells fascinated me. Mom made me release them at the end of the trip, but I remember moaning at her that I was going to anyway. But now, as a teenager, the thought of being stuck in the middle of nowhere with my boring folks, my bratty younger siblings with bugs, and zero phone signal was not appealing, and as a result, I stuck my earphones in. I sulked for the first 4 hours of the journey, and I refused to get out of the car to go into the diner. That was a bad move on my part, and I spent the next hour breathing in the hamburger and cheese fry smell that seemed to cling to my siblings' clothes, and listening to my gurgling stomach. We were on one of those forest roads through the state forest. It was a forest that seemed to just stretch on for eternity. It was hot and sweaty in the back of that car. There wasn't enough room to move or even think properly. And I noticed how we were just all a tangled mass of shirt fabric and arms. And then as I looked at their spiky fir trees, I felt this nagging feeling in my bladder. And I tried to ignore it, but we all know that only makes it worse. My little brother Freddie did not help. He saw me crossing my legs and he started making it worse. He started making dripping sounds. I tried reaching across my sister Flora to make him stop, but in the process, Mom and Dad's seats were kicked and thudded and they started telling us off. Now, my siblings blamed me. I blamed Freddie, and then we started arguing. And Dad pulled the Toyota Sienna into a turn-in, turned the engine off, and stuck his head in the back. The vein on his temple was throbbing from his anger. It seemed to take on an angular shape. It was something that I never noticed really before. And there was just something about my dad reaching that level of anger caused me to laugh. Laughter that seemed to diffuse the situation. And suddenly he was sighing, he was shaking his head, and he said, "Kids, seriously. We only have about a 40-minute drive left. Can't you save the arguing for when me and your mom aren't in earshot?" Freddie and Flora, they sheepishly apologized, but I was already jumping out of the car. I was shouting back to them, "Hey, I'll be back in a couple of minutes." Little did I know that at the time, those would be my last words to them. And I was unknowingly leaving them to endure an immeasurable horror. As I hurried through the tree line, I heard Freddie loudly tell them that I was about to wet myself. I kept my earphones in and I turned up the volume. I wandered far away enough to not be seen. I did my thing and I walked back to the car. I was nodding my head in time to the beat. I remember that, but I don't remember what song it was. I mean, no matter how hard I try to recall it, I guess some things are best not remembered. And as I walked, I saw this shadow blur past the trees to the side of me, and I instantly presumed that it was just one of my siblings messing about. So without removing my earphones, I shouted, "You better go back to the car before Dad freaks out." And I looked around, but I couldn't see any more shadow outlines, so I figured that they'd run back to the car. And I was almost free of the trees when I saw something scratched into the gnarly trunk of a fir tree. A triangle at a slight angle, like an acute triangle, but with the joins in the corners kind of trailing off out of some kind of pattern. I don't know, I can't really explain it, but looking at that triangle carved right there in the bark, it gave me this unsettling feeling just deep in my gut. Something just did not feel right about it. And I just wanted to get back to the car as quickly as possible. I quickly scanned over the area to check for the shadows in the trees, and on not seeing anything, I hurried forward, the music still blaring in my ears, but unable to drown out the uneasiness I felt. As I stepped clear of the trees and I saw the car, I had to grasp my hands to my mouth not to scream. Some things can never be forgotten, no matter how hard you try. And that was one of those things. Nothing could have prepared me for what I was seeing. The windows were all smashed and red-soaked glass covered the road. The tires were slashed, causing the car's bulky frame to sink lopsided onto the road. And there were scratches across the shiny blue pavement, dozens of them. My eyes darted from one to another, desperately trying to just make sense of it. And rags of clothes were caught in the remaining glass shards and blowing gently in the breeze. It was surreal, and it didn't feel real. I'd been gone for 5 minutes, 10 tops. How could my world implode within that short space of time? Chills tickled my spine as I stared at that bloody glass and rags of clothes, and I felt utter dread as I thought about my family. I pulled my earphones out, and a numb silence came over me. My ears seemed to ring as I stood there, frozen, convinced that this must be some sort of fever dream. The longer that I stared at that carnage in front of me, the more real it began to feel. I smelt the death in the air. This burning, rotting, grease-laden smell seemed to be all around me, festering there. I held my breath, and I slowly walked closer to the car, aware that my parents and my siblings had to be somewhere, and that despite how terrifying it was, I needed to make sure that they weren't still hiding or they were injured in that car. And on reaching the side of the car, I saw it on the back passenger door, and I just felt the sick curdle in my stomach. An acute triangle with overlapping lines at its start and finish was scratched into the door. It was the same marking on that tree, and I just looked at that piece of fabric caught in the glass, brown and white check. I recognized that, and my heart lurched. It was from Freddie's shirt. I covered my mouth with my hand as I made myself look through that window, and my family wasn't there. Glass and blood specks splattered the seats, but they weren't in there. I didn't know where my family was, but I could feel it. Something was watching me from those trees. I was trying not to show panic on the outside, even though inside I was falling apart. I stepped away from the car, glancing at that triangle scratched into the door. I put my earphones in and I turned up the volume, my own way of trying to escape this warped reality as I walked along the road. And I checked my phone, but there was no reception out there. All I could do was just keep on walking and hope a car would come and help me. The music couldn't deafen my thoughts. I wanted to believe that my family was safe somewhere and waiting for me, that I had to just keep on walking and I would catch up with them because Flora was slow. I knew these thoughts were make-believe, but they were the only thing that kept me going. Green swayed around me and music filled my ears, but I continued to walk along the road, not faltering despite my tiring feet and my shrieking heart. And I saw something moving from the tree line beyond the swaying branches. I stopped walking and I just stared forward, watching in disbelief as I saw Flora step out of the tree line. She was no longer wearing that cream cardigan that she had on over her dress, and her clothes were mud and blood stained. Her eyes met mine, and I yanked one earphone out, with my feet carrying me toward her without question, and I just called to her, "Flora, what happened? Are you okay? Where are the others?" She didn't speak. She just looked at me without blinking, and her mouth was curled in a slight smile as she pressed her index finger to her lips. I felt the fear tickle at my skin as I spotted it right there on the side of her finger, carved in bloody acute triangle, the start and end lines overlapping, and the blood had smudged into her finger creases. I reached out to grab her. I wanted to ask her who had done this to her. I wanted to ask her so many things, and before I reached her, she stepped back, and I was there gripping at air. and watching as she turned and she disappeared again beyond the trees. I called out to her to stop, to come back, to stay along the road with me. Words I screamed at her, but that to me came out quiet. The music from one earphone drowning out my pleas. No part of me wanted to step beyond that tree line, but she was my little sister who had endured a traumatic event, and I couldn't just step away and leave her. She was all I had left. So I started running after her, weaving around the tree trunks as I followed her shadow. She must have been so frightened, and she seemed to always just be ahead of me and out of reach, and no matter how quickly I moved. I called for her to stop. Silence surrounded me. Silence apart from the crunching of the leaves and my pounding heart. And it took me a few more moments to realize that my music had stopped and I couldn't see Flora anymore, but I saw something on the ground up ahead of me. And I edged toward it. I was sinking my front teeth into my crusty bottom lip as I moved forward to it, and I stared at the ground, my eyes hovering over 3 pieces of clothing. Freddie's checked shirt, Flora's cream cardigan, and my dad's gray sweater. They were all rolled up and arranged into an acute triangle, and the overlapping point tied in place with my mom's satin green scarf. None of this made any sense, but I was seeing it with my own eyes. As I stared at my family's items, I heard crunching leaves and I looked up. Fear was circling my body as I saw that shadow flit past the trees. I only caught a glimpse of it, but I saw enough to know that whoever it was not Flora. It was not a member of my family. I whispered Flora's name as I rushed back the way I'd come, scrambling my way past the trees, gasping for breath where I could. Trees blurred into more trees, and the disorientation hit me. But I kept on going, aware of that flitting shadow in the trees, aware that something was out there, and it was moving me in a certain direction. I don't even know how long I was there, in the forest, but I remember the trees thinning as I ran, and then I was free of them, and I was able to see the road ahead of me. And I stopped dead, aware something was on the ground in front of me. I looked down and I screamed in pure dread. In front of me, just inches from my feet, were 3 mangled, bloody human fingers arranged into an acute triangle. I spotted the sparkling sapphire ring on the one finger, and I felt sick fill my mouth. I recognized that ring. I looked at it enough times to know that it was my mother's wedding ring. At the overlapping point were 2 small, broken off fingernails. With my whole body trembling, I stepped around them and I staggered to the road. I dared myself to look back once, and I saw the shadowy outline there in the trees. It was darkness, a piece of darkness with no light. And as I walked, my music started playing of its own accord. I walked along the road in a trance, and after that, I lost all sense of time. My feet carried me forward, but my mind had switched off. It was too painful to think and feel at that moment. And eventually a car came by and saw me. They took me to the police, and it was days before the music stopped playing in my head, and I acknowledged them. It's my fault. My dad stopped the car. I got out of the car. I left them there to face that fate. A fate that I don't understand wasn't also meant for me. Why didn't that thing take me to? What lesson am I supposed to learn from all this? I'll never speak of this again. I will carry the pain with me, silently and alone, the way it's meant to be. Shea Robinson only did ever give one account of what happened to her to the police, and due to being so traumatized by what she endured, it took her 4 years to tell it. The family's car was discovered on the turn-in, or had been set on fire. Items of blood-soaked clothing belonging to her family were discovered in different areas of the Tillamook State Forest. However, despite extensive searches, none of Shea's family members, the severed fingers, or mysterious acute triangle symbols were ever found. It's unknown for sure what happened to Shea's family during that short time that she was absent from the car, but many believe that a dark force was at play. And on being asked about this case and if he thought that Shea Robinson may be behind her family's disappearance, Officer Dunn responded he didn't believe this. And when questioned further on why he was so sure, he simply replied, "The truth and its horrors were shown in her eyes." What do you think really happened to Shea? Have you heard of similar stories in your local state forest or at Tillamook? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you feel like in this situation? But what would you have done differently? Comment your whys and what ifs in the comments below, and I'll read every single one of them and respond to them all too. And for more scary horror stories, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.